Hello, history scholars. Mrs. Olson here. Today's lesson is titled Continental Congress. Now, we've been learning about the American Revolution, and now we are going to start studying some big events that happened during and came out of the American Revolution. So before we get into the lesson, now is a great time to pull out a piece of paper and a writing utensil so that you can record notes. And then with these notes, you can use them on the lesson questions, the assignment for this lesson. Now, let's begin with the learning target. It says that you will be able to understand how the government was first organized in the United States. So the way that the government is organized today got its start actually in the American Revolution. All right, guys, make sure that paper and pen is handy. We are going to our very first slide for the Continental Congress. Okay, here we go. So, 5 W's. What is the Continental Congress? Well, your note reads that the people that made up the Continental Congress were representatives from each of the 13 colonies. And this was a meeting that happened during the Revolutionary War. So, a bunch of men, they happen to be white men, okay? Women, Native Americans, African Americans, none of those are allowed to be representatives. So white men from each of the 13 colonies met during the Revolutionary War, okay? That's what the Continental Congress is. It's a meeting of men. Okay, now we used this word representative. Now, when we're talking about representatives, we might also use the word delegate. So it means the same thing. They are synonyms, words that mean the same thing. They just happen to be different words, okay? So the delegates met for the Continental Congress, or you could say representatives met in the Continental Congress. Okay, so it says that men who are chosen to speak for their people in their colonies. So remember that the people that are involved in the Continental Congress, they are representatives, they are men who are chosen by the people in the colonies to go to this meeting and to essentially be their voices. So if the colonists had concerns, they would tell these 1 or 2, maybe 3 men from each of the colonies, and then those men, the representatives, would then go to the Continental Congress and be the voice for all of the people that they represented. Okay, so there's a picture of one of the first there's actually 2 Continental Congresses. So there's a first Continental Congress and there is a second Continental Congress. And this is just a picture of the first one. Okay, moving on. When did they meet? So we want to make sure that we are putting all of the events, the battles, the people, and what they did kind of in order. So we have a comprehensive, that means like an entire view or understanding of the American Revolution. Okay, so for example, the Intolerable Acts, many of them were passed in the 1760s. The First Continental Congress, they met in 1774. Make sure that you write this down, and 1774 is one of the dates that you remember. Okay, now remember I said that there was also a Second Continental Congress, and they met a year later in 1775. Okay, where did they meet? You might not think that's very important, but these first meeting places of our forefathers, they are famous places now, and sometimes you can go visit them if you go to the East Coast, and you can some of them are made into museums, for example, and you can go visit these places where important documents were signed and decisions were made. Okay, so the First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia at Carpenter's Hall. And actually, both of them, both the First and the Second Continental Congress, they met in Philadelphia. They just happened to meet in two different buildings, if you will. So this is a picture of Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia. So this is where the First Continental Congress met. It's always good to put some of these pictures to the details, the historic details that we're learning about. Okay, and this is what Carpenter's Hall looks like today. All right, more on the Continental Congress. Here's another W. Why? Well, why are these men meeting? The answer to the why is the Intolerable Acts. Do you remember a whole bunch of these? The Boston Port Act, the Quartering Act, um, there's more. We learned about a whole bunch of them. The Stamp Act. Well, all of these laws, these acts, were put into place to control the colonists. Remember, King George III of Britain wants to make sure that the colonists are following his rules. And the colonists feel like these are too constricting of rules. So, if you ask why the Continental Congress met, let's blame it on the Intolerable Acts. Blame King George III. Okay, so this note reads, Britain's decisions about keeping the colonists in line with the Intolerable Acts only made the colonists resent the British. So resent means that you don't like that person because of the decisions that they made. You have kind of a bad taste in your mouth for some of the things that they've done, as what King George III did to the colonists in the 1760s and the 1770s. Okay? All right, so here I am. I'm changing up the word representative. Representative and delegates, they mean the same thing. So the delegates take action. What did they do in response to this mountain of intolerable acts? Well, they decided that they would draft a letter, they would write a letter, and in this letter they asked the king to have a sit down to talk about their grievances. Now we're bringing forth a whole bunch of new words today. A grievance you can think of as a complaint. So let's take a timeout just for a second, a thinking timeout from the American Revolution, and think about what a grievance might look like today. So if you're a kid, you might have a grievance against your parent. You might have a complaint against your parent. Maybe there's a rule that you don't necessarily like, and you have this grievance, you have a complaint about it, and you want to talk to them about it. Maybe it's your sibling that has committed this action and you have a grievance against their behavior or maybe something that they said. Okay? So a grievance is a complaint. And if we think back to the Intolerable Acts, then you know that the colonists have many grievances to bring up with King George III. Okay, another new word, guys, boycott. And in parentheses, I put what that means. And when you boycott something, you stop using it or you stop buying it. So what the colonists decided to do was to boycott British goods. So they stopped buying, say, spoons from Great Britain, or they would stop buying tea from Great Britain. Okay? And eventually the non-exportation of American products, meaning that they would not export, they would not send and then sell the products that were being made in America to the British. So this is a really big deal because if the Americans are not buying British goods, that means that British merchants and really the country of Britain, they're not making money from the Americans, and then they are not able to buy American products. Okay, Another thing that the delegates did, besides write a letter and then stage this boycott, was they actually set a date for another Congress, for another meeting to happen. And this was a year later in 1775. And as you know from a few slides ago, this was the Second Continental Congress. So those are the three big things that they did or agreed to in 1774. Okay, so this is a primary document. So this is one of the documents that comes out of the First Continental Congress, and I thought it might be a fun thing to share. You can see that it says Philadelphia on the top, and then what looks like F's, like E, F, G, F, are actually S's in this type of font that they used way back in the 1700s. And so I'm going to leave it up just so that you can see what it says. That the Congress request the merchants and others in several colonies not to send to Great Britain any orders for goods, right? So they're not going to ask Britain for any goods, and to direct the execution of all orders already sent to be delayed or suspended until I'm not sure what this word is, of the Congress on the means to be taken for the preservation of the liberties of America is made public. So essentially, this is saying that until Britain grants them, the colonists, what they want, they are not going to buy British goods, and they're not going to send American goods until American liberties are recognized. Okay. Now, there were traditions that were established that we honor today when the Continental Congress met. So, representatives, right, the delegates that attended the meeting were known as a Congress of People. And today, that is where we get our term Congress, right? So from each state, we get 2 representatives that are sent to Washington, D.C. to speak on our behalf. And later on, we're going to get into how Congress is divided, and that is the Senate and the House of Representatives. So we'll save that part for just a little bit later. But the people that we elect in the state of Washington go to Washington, D.C. to represent us and our voices. Okay, in the Continental Congress, they elected a leader, and they called this leader a president. Hey, that's what we still call the president of our country, or the leader of our country, a president. Okay, famous people that were involved in the Continental Congress. So I abbreviated Continental Congress with a CC. So in the first one, who's heard of Patrick Henry? Anybody? How about John Adams or Samuel Adams? George Washington? Have you guys heard of him? Or how about a person named John Jay? Okay, all of these famous men were involved in the First Continental Congress. And so most of these guys are involved in the Second Continental Congress, but in the second one, there were new people, including Benjamin Franklin. Anybody ever hear of him? Thomas Jefferson and John Hancock. Okay, and on this slide, I chose a whole bunch of them, not all of them, but to show you famous people involved in the Continental Congress. Now, out of those famous names, how many became presidents of the United States later? A whole bunch of them, huh? Okay, lasting accomplishments. What came out of the Continental Congress? Well, first of all, the Continental Congress issued, so they gave out, and they also borrowed money. This is kind of a big deal. This is what governments do, and this is one of the first acts of the American government. They issued and borrowed money. the Postal Service was established. Okay, so our post office sending mail, receiving mail. And our first Navy. Does anybody have a family member or a friend who's in the Navy? And there is a picture of the colonial or American colonial Navy in the American Revolution. Okay. In 1776, Congress decided unanimously. So unanimously is everybody, 100%. Nobody said no. But they decided unanimously that the United Colonies were free and independent states. So United Colonies is going to turn into the United States of America. Okay, they wrote the Declaration of Independence, which is one of our next lessons. And they prepared the Articles of Confederation, and this is better known as our United States Constitution. Okay, so ending with not a photograph, a painting and image of the Second Continental Congress. George Washington, Ben Franklin. Do you remember that Thomas Jefferson was one of the people? Samuel and John Adams. Okay, and then I'm going to end with kind of a funny cartoon. We celebrate the 4th of July, and this is like a modern guy, right? Here are some famous people that were part of the Continental Congress. You can see that it says, in Congress, July 4th, 1776. Gentlemen, now that we've declared our independence, let's say we kick back and pursue a little happiness. Just kind of funny. Okay. So that is the end of the lesson for Continental Congress. Use the notes that you took on the lesson questions and make sure that if you have any questions that you ask me. Bye guys.